Wyatt Calloway walked into the Kingsley conference room carrying inheritance papers for an abandoned airfield, mud still clinging to his boots and a jacket worn thin at the shoulders. Evangeline Kingsley looked at him the way a woman looks at someone dragging in the wreckage of a life that never mattered to her. She smiled coldly and called his inheritance a dead slab of concrete, sitting in a pasture nobody wanted. The whole board laughed along with her. Wyatt did not argue. He simply set an old brass key on the polished table and said nothing else. 3 hours later, the abandoned airfield lit up from beneath the ground, and a buried system announced a secret worth $4,800,000,000. If you enjoy stories where arrogance finally meets its match, press subscribe now so you never miss what happens next. The story begins in a small town called Briar Glen, Oklahoma, where a forgotten airstrip named Callaway Field had sat untouched for decades. The runway had cracked into a mosaic of gray fragments. The terminal windows were coated in years of dust, and weeds climbed past knee-height along the fence line. Locals treated the place as a punchline, a rusted relic nobody bothered to mention except as a landmark for giving directions. It had once been useful, but time had buried that usefulness under neglect and indifference. Nobody driving past it imagined it held anything more than broken asphalt and old memories. The town itself had grown used to overlooking Callaway Field the same way people grow used to ignoring a scar they have carried for years, something familiar enough to stop noticing entirely even as it sat in plain view every single day. Teenagers occasionally snuck onto the property at night, daring each other to walk the length of the old runway in the dark, always leaving before their nerve gave out completely. Farmers who owned neighboring land joked that the airfield was good for exactly one thing: keeping the coyotes contained to a single stretch of overgrown grass. Even the county clerk's office listed the property under a category reserved for structures awaiting eventual demolition, a quiet, bureaucratic verdict nobody had bothered to contest. Miles Calloway had lived long enough to hear every one of those jokes, and he had never once corrected anyone, choosing instead to let the town believe exactly what it wanted to believe. Wyatt had grown up hearing his grandfather speak about the airfield in fragments, brief remarks here and there that never seemed to form a complete picture. Miles would sometimes drive out to the property alone in the evenings, returning hours later without explanation, his hands smelling faintly of oil and machinery. As a boy, Wyatt assumed his grandfather simply enjoyed nostalgia, wandering old grounds tied to a career that had quietly ended without fanfare. He never imagined those solitary visits carried any weight beyond sentiment, and Miles never gave him a reason to think otherwise. Looking back after the funeral, Wyatt realized how carefully his grandfather had guarded a silence that spanned decades. Wyatt Calloway returned to Briar Glen after burying his grandfather, Miles Calloway, a former aviation engineer who had spent his final years living quietly at the edge of town. The will was read in a small office above the hardware store, and within minutes, Wyatt learned the entire airfield had been left to him. Most people in Briar Glen considered this news a burden rather than a gift, and they said so openly at the diner and the gas station. Between back taxes, decaying infrastructure, and mounting legal fees, the inheritance looked less like a windfall and more like a slow financial bleed. Wyatt, a single father who valued stability over spectacle, understood the practical weight of what he now owned, and more than once he considered simply selling the land to be free of it. Inside a wooden box his grandfather left behind, Wyatt found an old brass key, a hand-drawn map of the runway, and a note written in Miles's steady handwriting. The note read simply that he should not sell the sky before he understood what was buried beneath the ground. Wyatt read the words twice, folded the map, and placed the key in his pocket without fully understanding why it mattered. He assumed grief was clouding his judgment, that an old man's cryptic message was nothing more than sentiment dressed up as mystery. A single day after the will became public record, a corporate letter arrived from a company called Kingsley Aero Logistics, offering to buy Callaway Field for a price so low it barely covered the property taxes. Wyatt was summoned to a temporary Kingsley office in Tulsa, where the company was assembling land for a massive new aviation logistics project. Evangeline Kingsley walked into the meeting with the posture of someone who had never once been told no, and believed her presence alone should settle the matter. She barely acknowledged Wyatt beyond a glance at his worn jacket, his calloused hands, and the yellowed inheritance documents tucked under his arm. Her financial advisor, Preston Waverly, laid out a formal offer of $180,000, far below any reasonable valuation for the land. Preston explained, almost bored, that the airfield had no operating certification, no commercial routes, and by his estimation, no future worth discussing. The conference room itself seemed designed to remind visitors of their place, all glass walls and polished steel, with a skyline view meant to intimidate rather than welcome. Wyatt sat alone on one side of the table, while an entire row of Kingsley executives faced him from the other, folders neatly stacked and expressions already decided before he had said a single word. Nobody offered him coffee or water, a small omission that felt deliberate rather than accidental. Evangeline flipped through his inheritance papers with the detachment of someone reviewing a grocery receipt, occasionally exchanging a glance with Preston that Wyatt understood immediately as amusement disguised as professionalism. He had walked into plenty of rooms in his life where people underestimated him, but rarely one arranged so precisely for that exact purpose. Wyatt asked a simple question that unsettled the room more than he expected. He wanted to know why a billion-dollar company would care so much about land with no future at all. Evangeline offered a thin, dismissive smile before answering that sometimes companies purchase garbage simply to clear the way for something with real value. The remark drew quiet laughter from the board members seated around the table, and nobody bothered to hide their amusement at Wyatt's expense. She went further, telling him directly that a poor man should not confuse family memories with actual assets. Evangeline had built her entire reputation on decisiveness, having inherited her position within the Kingsley family business at a young age and spending years proving she belonged there through sheer force of will. She viewed sentiment as a liability, something people clung to when they lacked the confidence to make hard, profitable decisions. To her, Wyatt represented exactly the kind of obstacle she had learned to remove quickly and efficiently throughout her career, a small inconvenience standing between her company and a project that would define her legacy. She had no reason to expect this meeting would end any differently than dozens of similar acquisitions she had closed before. Wyatt did not raise his voice or defend himself with words. He simply signed a refusal to sell and left the papers on the table before walking out. Pressure arrived almost immediately after his refusal became known. County officials sent a notice claiming the airfield's perimeter fencing violated safety codes and could result in fines. The bank called about a property tax payment that had somehow become overdue despite Wyatt's careful records. An unfamiliar contractor showed up uninvited and quoted repair costs nearly 3 times the standard local rate. Wyatt recognized the pattern forming around him, a deliberate attempt to drain his resources until surrender felt like his only option. He spent long nights at his kitchen table sorting through the notices, cross-referencing dates, and noticing how every complaint traced back to filings submitted within days of his refusal to sell. A neighbor mentioned, almost in passing, that a well-dressed stranger had been asking questions around town about Wyatt's finances and his daily routine. Another acquaintance said a man matching Preston's description had been seen speaking privately with the county assessor's office earlier that same week. None of it was proof exactly, but taken together, the pattern felt too coordinated to be coincidence. Wyatt kept working, kept paying what he could, and kept refusing to let exhaustion make his decisions for him. Preston Waverly returned to the airfield in person, delivering a blunt warning that if Wyatt refused to sell within the week, the property could be seized through tax proceedings or drawn into prolonged litigation. He presented a second offer, even lower than before, at $120,000, framing it as Wyatt's final chance to step away from what he called an old man's dead dream. Preston spoke with the practiced confidence of someone who had delivered similar ultimatums many times before, clearly expecting Wyatt to fold under the combined weight of financial pressure and social embarrassment. He even suggested, almost casually, that continuing to fight would only delay the inevitable while draining whatever savings Wyatt had left to protect his own family. Wyatt still refused, though the constant pressure had begun to wear on him more than he admitted aloud. He lay awake some nights running numbers in his head, wondering whether stubbornness had quietly become recklessness disguised as principle. Yet every time doubt crept in, he thought back to his grandfather's handwriting on that small folded note, the quiet certainty behind those simple words. Instead of giving in, he began inspecting the property more carefully, walking every hangar and inch of runway with fresh eyes. Beneath the visible decay, he noticed details that seemed out of place for an ordinary regional airstrip. The underground electrical conduits had not been fully disconnected, unlike most abandoned airfields where power lines were stripped for scrap long ago. Sections of the runway used a denser, reinforced concrete unlike anything typically found on small civilian strips. The control tower contained coated panels that resembled something closer to military logistics infrastructure than a rural airport. Digging through his grandfather's old files late one night, Wyatt found repeated references to something called Project Meridian, a name he had never heard before. When he searched for it online, he found absolutely nothing. No records, no articles, no trace that it had ever existed publicly. That same night, a black SUV parked quietly outside the airfield gates, its headlights cutting through the darkness like a warning. The SUV belonged to Harlan Whitcomb, an aging attorney who had once worked closely with Miles Calloway decades earlier. Harlan told Wyatt he had been waiting patiently for him to grow calm enough to start asking the right questions instead of simply reacting to fear. He revealed that Calloway Field had once served as a private testing airstrip years earlier, used for far more than routine flights. It had functioned as a testing ground for automated cargo routing systems, heavy-load runway engineering, and an underground cable network connected to a decommissioned military transport corridor. Miles Calloway, Harlan explained, had partnered directly with the early founder of what eventually became Kingsley Aero Logistics before everything collapsed under a legal dispute. After that dispute, Kingsley grew into a sprawling corporate giant, while Miles quietly retained the airfield along with a hidden stake in the underlying technology. Wyatt asked why his grandfather never simply sold the land once it became a financial burden rather than an asset. Harlan answered that Miles always believed Kingsley would return someday, and he wanted his eventual heir to hold the power to refuse them when that day arrived. He handed Wyatt half of an old technical archive, explaining that the remaining half was sealed inside a vault beneath Hangar 7, accessible only with the brass key Miles had left behind. Wyatt realized then that his inheritance was never really the airfield itself. It was control over something buried far beneath it, something valuable enough to make a global logistics company chase a struggling single father across state lines. Harlan spoke slowly, choosing his words with the caution of a man who had carried a secret far longer than he ever intended to. He described how the falling out between Miles and the founding Kingsley executive had been bitter and personal, involving accusations of stolen credit and broken promises that never made it into any public record. Miles had walked away from the partnership with nothing but the land itself, and a portion of the underlying framework buried beneath it, choosing quiet dignity over a costly legal fight he was unlikely to win outright. He never spoke of it publicly again, not even to close friends, burying the entire chapter the same way he buried the technology itself. Harlan admitted he had honored that silence for years, waiting for the day someone in the Calloway family would finally be ready to hear the truth. Wyatt asked what exactly had changed to make Harlan decide that day had finally arrived. Harlan explained that watching Wyatt refuse Kingsley's lowball offers again and again, despite mounting financial pressure, reminded him unmistakably of Miles at that same age. It was not stubbornness for its own sake, but a quiet, principled refusal to let outsiders dictate the value of something built through years of careful, unseen work. Harlan said he had kept a private list over the years, quietly noting every attempt by outside parties to inquire about the airfield, always turning them away without explanation. Kingsley's recent aggressive approach through Preston had finally convinced him the moment for silence had passed completely. Evangeline decided to escalate the pressure publicly, organizing a formal site visit with board members, investors, and local media crews. Her goal was straightforward: humiliate Wyatt into surrender by proving to everyone watching that Calloway Field was worthless land clinging to a dead past. A convoy of expensive vehicles rolled onto the cracked runway, forming a striking contrast against Wyatt standing alone near the crumbling terminal building. Preston made a point of loudly comparing the setting to an abandoned film location, drawing scattered laughter from a few investors trailing behind him. Evangeline stood in front of the cameras and declared that Kingsley intended to transform this dead land into a modern shipping hub, blaming Wyatt for stubbornly clinging to nostalgia instead of progress. Wyatt answered her calmly, without raising his voice or flinching under the attention of the cameras. He told her she called it the past, only because she did not yet hold the authority to unlock its future. Evangeline dismissed the remark as empty theater meant to save face in front of an audience. She pushed harder, offering a final public number of $250,000, sweetened with a hollow promise to name a small waiting lounge after his grandfather. Wyatt refused again, this time in front of every camera and every investor standing on that runway. Furious at the public rejection, Evangeline announced she would prove the property was worth nothing more than scrap metal value, determined to strip away whatever dignity remained attached to the Callaway name. A few of the investors traded uneasy glances, sensing something in Wyatt's composure that did not match the picture Evangeline had painted before their arrival. He did not look like a desperate man clinging to sentiment, nor did he look intimidated by the wealth surrounding him on every side. One older investor, a quiet man near the back of the group, later admitted he found the standoff more interesting than anything else planned for that afternoon. Evangeline, sensing the moment slipping slightly out of her control, insisted the group continue toward the hangars so cameras could capture the depth of the property's disrepair. She wanted footage that would embarrass Wyatt into compliance long before anyone reached the far end of the runway. As the group moved toward Hangar 7, Wyatt used the brass key to open a hidden side door concealed beneath layers of old paint. Inside, past broken machinery and settled dust, stood a freight elevator leading down into the earth, something none of the visitors expected to find. Evangeline froze at the sight of it, while Preston tried desperately to steer everyone away, insisting the area below was structurally unsafe. Harlan arrived just in time with legal documentation, proving Wyatt held full authority to access whatever existed beneath the surface of his own property. Reluctantly, security allowed the group to descend, cameras still rolling, curiosity overpowering caution among the investors. Beneath the hangar sat a technical facility remarkably well preserved despite years of abandonment. Old servers lined the walls, alongside flight corridor maps, logistics simulation panels, and sealed archive crates stacked neatly in rows. A control board bore a single label etched in metal, Meridian Routing Grid, silent and untouched for years. Wyatt used a code etched into his grandfather's old pocket watch to power the system on for the first time in a very long while. Screens flickered awake after years of darkness, slowly displaying lines of data that had been waiting patiently underground. A low mechanical hum spread through the chamber as backup generators kicked in, filling the stale air with the faint scent of warming machinery that had been dormant far too long. Several members of the group instinctively stepped backward, unsettled by a room coming back to life after appearing dead for so many years. The system confirmed ownership in plain, unmistakable text across the main display, naming Callaway as the primary controlling heir of the entire Meridian asset. The mood in the room shifted instantly, the earlier laughter replaced by uneasy silence spreading across the group. Evangeline stepped closer to the screen, recognizing symbols and formatting nearly identical to the technology framework her own company depended on for its massive upcoming project. What had been mocked minutes earlier as worthless now appeared to sit at the very foundation of everything Kingsley was preparing to build. Harlan addressed the stunned board directly, explaining that Project Meridian was an automated cargo routing system Miles Callaway had helped design decades earlier. It included far more than software alone, encompassing infrastructure rights, runway certifications, underground signal stations, and legal access to an experimental flight corridor still active beneath their feet. One of the younger engineers accompanying the investors leaned toward the screen, whispering to a colleague that the routing architecture looked more advanced than anything currently deployed across Kingsley's active network. He said it quietly, almost to himself, but the remark carried far enough for Evangeline to hear every word of it. Preston tried once more to downplay the discovery, suggesting the system was likely outdated and irrelevant to modern operations. Wyatt simply pointed to a status indicator glowing steadily near the bottom corner of the screen, still actively synced to an external corridor network after all these years of silence. The realization that this forgotten basement had been quietly running in the background the entire time settled over the room like a physical weight. Kingsley Aerologistics was preparing to finalize a contract worth $4.8 billion to build a high-speed cargo network spanning multiple states. That contract, Harlan explained, required documented proof of control over the original Meridian corridor, proof that existed only here, beneath Callaway Field. Without this specific site, Kingsley possessed nothing more than branding and ambition, lacking the technical and legal backbone required to move forward. Evangeline tried to argue that Kingsley had owned Meridian outright for years, but Wyatt opened a sealed document proving otherwise. Inside were original signatures from both the founding Kingsley executive and Miles Callaway, splitting foundational ownership equally until the project was formally reactivated. Preston's face drained of color as the implications settled across the room. Grant Ashford, chairman of the Kingsley board, ordered the media crew to immediately stop filming, but the damage among the investors had already been done. Every person standing in that basement had witnessed the discovery firsthand, and there was no undoing what they now understood. Wyatt did not need to raise his voice to make his point land, with full weight. He simply told Evangeline that the worthless inheritance she had mocked in front of her board had just become the single condition standing between her and the survival of her most important project. Grant Ashford pulled Evangeline aside briefly, speaking in a low tone that still carried far enough for Wyatt to catch fragments of the exchange. He reminded her that the board had already promised shareholders a signed agreement within the coming quarter, and any delay now could trigger serious financial consequences for the entire company. Evangeline nodded stiffly, her earlier confidence replaced by the calculated stillness of someone recalculating every option available to her. She was used to controlling outcomes long before they became public, and the sensation of losing that control in front of witnesses left her visibly rattled. For the first time since Wyatt had met her, she looked less like a woman issuing orders, and more like someone bracing for consequences she had never planned for. Evangeline pulled Preston aside, demanding to know how he had failed to uncover something this significant during his research. Preston claimed the original archive had been lost over time, but Harlan quickly produced correspondence proving otherwise. The letters showed Preston had previously hired outside legal counsel specifically to explore ways of invalidating Wyatt's inheritance rights altogether. It became clear that Kingsley's interest was never simple land acquisition. Preston understood the Meridian connection from the beginning and deliberately concealed it from Evangeline. His plan involved acquiring the airfield cheaply, then privately selling controlling rights to a separate group of investors for personal gain. Wyatt realized his humiliation had never been about his financial situation alone. He had been treated as an obstacle, small enough to remove quietly from a much larger game being played above his head. Evangeline still had not fully aligned herself with Wyatt, her anger at being deceived colliding with her instinct to regain control of the situation immediately. She offered an on-the-spot buyout of $30 million, hoping sheer numbers might finally end the standoff in her favor. Wyatt declined without hesitation, and the entire board sat in stunned silence at the refusal. Preston attempted to interject, insisting the number Evangeline offered was more than generous given the circumstances surrounding the property. Wyatt turned to him directly for the first time since the correspondence had been revealed, his voice calm but unmistakably firm. He reminded Preston that generosity looked very different from a man who had spent weeks trying to strip away every ounce of leverage a struggling family held onto. The room grew quiet again, several board members shifting uncomfortably as the weight of Preston's earlier conduct settled fully into view. Evangeline said nothing in his defense, and that silence alone told everyone present exactly where her loyalty now stood. When Evangeline asked what amount would finally satisfy him, Wyatt answered simply that he would not sell the only key to someone who had called it garbage only hours earlier. Before anyone could respond, the Meridian system displayed a new notification across the main screen. It indicated an additional undocumented asset remained sealed inside an archive located beneath runway number 2, something no one in the room had anticipated. Wyatt, Harlan, Evangeline, and a small technical team moved quickly toward the second runway to investigate the new discovery. Beneath the aged concrete surface, they located a concealed hatch disguised as a routine fuel inspection panel. Opening the hatch revealed a climate-controlled storage vault containing hundreds of blueprints, data drives, cargo drone prototypes, and archive testing permits dating back many years. Among the contents sat a single unpublished agreement labeled the Option Renewal Clause, a document none of them had known existed until that very moment. The clause stated that if Project Meridian were ever reactivated, the lawful heir of Miles Calloway would hold 3 distinct options moving forward. The first allowed the heir to sell full ownership rights outright to any interested party. The second granted the heir 18% equity in any resulting Meridian-based project going forward. The third, more severe option, permitted the heir to block the project entirely if Calloway's original contributions were not formally recognized and honored. Grant Ashford did the math almost instantly, calculating that 18% of a $4.8 billion contract equaled roughly $864 million, without even factoring in the added weight of legal control. If Wyatt chose instead to block the project outright, Kingsley risked losing the entire contract overnight, along with years of preparation and investment. For the first time since arriving, Evangeline fell completely silent, understanding the balance of power had shifted entirely away from her. She was no longer the one dictating terms from a position of wealth and status. She had become the one who needed to ask permission simply to continue moving forward. The vault itself felt strangely peaceful compared to the chaos unfolding above it, rows of carefully labeled containers preserved by a climate system that had apparently run undisturbed for years. Wyatt walked slowly between the shelves, running his fingers along dust-free surfaces that told a story of quiet, deliberate maintenance rather than neglect. Someone had been paying to keep this vault operational long after the rest of the airfield fell into disrepair above it, and Wyatt suspected he already knew who. Harlan confirmed it moments later, revealing that Miles had quietly funded a small private maintenance contract for over a decade, hidden within a modest personal expense account nobody thought to question. Even in death, his grandfather had been protecting something the rest of the world had already written off as gone. The site visit quickly transformed into an emergency negotiation held directly inside the old, dust-covered terminal building. Wooden tables, mismatched plastic chairs, and grimy windows stood in stark contrast to the tailored suits filling the room around them. Evangeline tried to maintain her composure, though the icy confidence from earlier had noticeably softened into something closer to caution. She asked Wyatt directly what conditions would be required for him to allow the project to move forward without interference. Wyatt paused, looking out across the runway where his grandfather had once spent countless hours working in obscurity, dismissed for years as irrelevant by people just like the ones now surrounding him. He finally laid out 4 specific conditions in a calm, steady voice that left no room for negotiation. Kingsley would need to publicly acknowledge Miles Calloway as a co-founder of Project Meridian, correcting years of erased history. Wyatt would retain permanent veto authority over any major decisions involving Meridian's underlying infrastructure moving forward. A compensation fund would be established for engineers previously pushed out or forgotten during the project's earlier collapse. Preston Waverly would be immediately suspended pending a full independent investigation into his conduct. Several board members reacted with visible frustration, arguing that Wyatt's demands reached far beyond reasonable compensation for a simple property dispute. Wyatt stood, closing his hand around the brass key resting on the table in front of him. He told them plainly that if his terms were unacceptable, Project Meridian would simply remain buried exactly where it had rested for years. Evangeline understood immediately that his words were not a bluff meant to pressure the room into panic. The most powerful executive in that building suddenly found herself with no remaining leverage against a man she had dismissed as insignificant only hours earlier. She asked for a brief recess to speak privately with Grant Ashford, and the two stepped into the hallway just outside the terminal's cracked glass doors. Through the thin walls, Wyatt could hear fragments of a tense exchange, Grant reminding her that shareholders would ask difficult questions if this contract collapsed under her leadership. When they returned, Evangeline's posture had changed, the confident authority replaced by something closer to careful restraint. She addressed Wyatt directly, telling him she was prepared to accept his conditions in principle, though certain details would need review from Kingsley's legal department before anything became official. Wyatt accepted the response calmly, aware that principle without signature meant very little in a room full of people who had spent the entire day trying to outmaneuver him. Preston refused to accept defeat quietly, launching accusations that Wyatt had illegally accessed protected infrastructure without proper authorization. He insisted the underground documents could easily have been fabricated and demanded security be called to seal off Callaway Field immediately. Wyatt remained composed as Harlan produced notarized copies of the original will, property deeds, founding partnership agreements, and formal inheritance confirmation letters. Every document held up under scrutiny, leaving Preston with nothing solid to stand on. Shifting tactics, Preston attacked Wyatt personally, calling him an underqualified single father with no business managing technology of national significance. The remark landed with an uncomfortable chill across the room, drawing visible disapproval even from members of Kingsley's own board. Wyatt looked directly at him and replied that competence was never measured by a bank balance, but by whether a person truly understood the ground they were standing on. Moments later, a technical staffer discovered that Preston had attempted to send an email requesting the deletion of Meridian data from one of Kingsley's secondary servers. That email had automatically synced into the archive system buried beneath Callaway Field, preserved without his knowledge. The staffer read the message aloud to the room, her voice steady, despite the tension thick enough to feel physically present. Preston tried to explain the email away as routine data management, but the timestamp placed it only minutes after the discovery of the Meridian system that same day. Nobody in the room believed his explanation, and even his closest allies on the board began quietly distancing themselves from him. Grant Ashford suspended Preston on the spot, in front of the very board members he had spent months manipulating for personal gain. Security escorted him from the building later that evening, though he continued insisting loudly that he had only been protecting the company's best interests the entire time. The man who had spent weeks pressuring Wyatt into selling for pennies on the dollar had just been exposed by the very system he tried to erase. Evangeline stood quietly amid the wreckage of her own boardroom drama, no longer able to hide behind confidence or status. She understood now that her biggest miscalculation had never been about undervaluing a piece of property. Her true mistake had been undervaluing the man standing directly in front of her from the very first meeting. In front of the remaining board members, she offered Wyatt a genuine apology, not the hollow, polished kind reserved for public relations damage control. She admitted she had used her position to belittle him, dismissed his family's legacy as meaningless, and allowed her own arrogance to nearly cost the company everything it had worked toward. Wyatt did not immediately offer forgiveness, telling her clearly that an apology only carried weight when paired with real action. Evangeline agreed to sign a formal memorandum right there inside Callaway Field, permanently recognizing Callaway family rights, confirming Preston's suspension, launching a full investigation, and naming Wyatt as strategic infrastructure partner over Project Meridian going forward. The board took an informal vote, and the majority approved the terms, understanding they no longer held any leverage to refuse. A junior associate scrambled to draft the memorandum by hand, using a laptop balanced on a dusty counter that had once served as an airline check-in desk decades earlier. Nobody complained about the makeshift setting, the urgency of the moment overriding any concern for formality or comfort. Harlan reviewed each clause carefully before allowing either party to sign, insisting on precise language that left no room for future disputes or reinterpretation. Wyatt watched quietly as the document took shape, thinking of the countless nights his grandfather must have spent imagining exactly this kind of reckoning without ever knowing whether it would actually arrive. When the final draft was ready, the room fell quiet in a way that felt entirely different from the tense silence earlier that day. Evangeline signed first, followed by Wyatt, his signature steady despite everything that had unfolded that day. As pen met paper, the Meridian system displayed a final message across its glowing screen, confirming that reactivation had officially been authorized. The airfield, once mocked as a dead, useless relic, had just been resurrected in front of the very woman who once wanted it erased entirely. Night settled over Briar Glen, and for the first time in many years, Callaway Field lit up from end to end. Runway lights switched on row by row, stretching like a glowing pathway across the dark, quiet fields surrounding the town. Investors, engineers, and board members stood in silence, watching a transformation none of them could have predicted only hours earlier. Nobody laughed anymore, and the cracked concrete no longer looked like decay, but instead resembled the scars of something that had quietly survived years of neglect. Wyatt stood near the control tower, calm and unhurried, watching the lights stretch out ahead of him without any need for celebration or applause. Harlan approached quietly, saying he believed Miles would have been deeply proud of what his grandson had accomplished that day. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Miles had once told him the airfield would only truly come back to life once someone stood on that runway who cared more about protecting it than profiting from it. Standing there in the glow of the newly lit lights, Harlan finally understood exactly what his old friend had meant all those years ago. Wyatt said little in response, simply nodding as he looked out across the field his grandfather had spent decades quietly guarding without ever explaining why. Evangeline walked over and asked Wyatt why he hadn't simply accepted a high offer and walked away from all the pressure months earlier. Wyatt answered that certain things should never be sold back to the very person who once tried to bury them completely. She had no argument to offer in response, standing quietly beside him as the runway lights illuminated the open field. A light breeze moved through the tall grass at the edge of the property, carrying with it the faint hum of the reactivated systems below their feet. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Evangeline felt something closer to humility than ambition settle over her. She admitted quietly that she had built her entire career believing leverage was the only language people truly respected. Standing on that runway, watching a man she had once mocked hold steady against every pressure her company could apply, she began to question whether that belief had ever really served her well. Wyatt did not offer easy reassurance, nor did he pretend the day's events had erased months of deliberate cruelty aimed at him and his family's legacy. He simply told her that respect, unlike leverage, could not be manufactured overnight, but it could be earned through consistent action over time. For the first time, Evangeline understood that real power was never about forcing someone to sign away everything they had. It was about recognizing exactly when to step back and allow something honest the chance to survive. Months later, Callaway Field no longer resembled the abandoned wreckage it once was, though the original weathered sign remained untouched at the entrance. It had become the primary testing hub for Project Meridian, while Miles Callaway's name was placed prominently in the main lobby, not as a symbolic gesture, but as long overdue recognition. Preston Waverly faced a formal investigation for concealing records and manipulating the original land acquisition process from the very beginning. Grant Ashford retained his chairman position, though he now operated under Wyatt's permanent veto authority over Meridian-related decisions. Evangeline remained chief executive, though her approach to leadership shifted noticeably, no longer equating a person's financial status with their actual worth. Wyatt never transformed into a flashy, attention-seeking millionaire chasing recognition or luxury. Instead, he used his share of the project's proceeds to restore the airfield properly, support the engineers once discarded during Meridian's earlier collapse, and protect family assets vulnerable to large corporations looking for an easy acquisition. He established a small scholarship in his grandfather's name for local students pursuing careers in aviation engineering, quietly funding it without ever seeking public credit for the gesture, preferring instead to let the work itself speak on his behalf. The town that once joked about Callaway Field being good for nothing more than containing coyotes now pointed to it with a quiet, genuine pride they had never expressed before. Harlan retired from active legal practice not long after the memorandum was finalized. Though he remained a trusted advisor, Wyatt continued to consult whenever new complications arose. Grant Ashford, despite his earlier discomfort with Wyatt's demands, eventually admitted in a private conversation that the veto authority had made the company more careful and more honest in its long-term planning. Preston Waverley's investigation concluded months later, resulting in his permanent removal from the industry and a settlement that quietly compensated several of the engineers he had once helped push aside. None of it undid the damage completely, but it offered something closer to accountability than most people in his position ever faced. In the final scene, Evangeline stood beside him, watching the newly lit runway stretch into the darkness ahead of them. She admitted quietly that she once called this very place useless, without a second thought. Wyatt replied that she hadn't seen it clearly back then, only through the eyes of someone who mistakenly believed she already owned the sky above it. A cargo test aircraft lifted off from Callaway Field moments later, its engines echoing across the open Oklahoma landscape as it climbed steadily into the night sky. On the ground below, Wyatt stood still, the old brass key resting quietly in his palm, the weight of it somehow lighter now than it had ever felt before. What had once felt like an unbearable burden left behind by his grandfather had finally revealed its true purpose, transforming from a source of quiet dread into a symbol of everything patience and integrity could accomplish. He thought of every person in Briar Glen who had once laughed at the idea of him owning anything worthwhile, and he felt no need to prove them wrong beyond simply continuing to do what was right. It stood as a lasting reminder that some secrets only surface when the person carrying them refuses to sell themselves short, no matter how loudly the world insists that they should.